You recently wrote an article, and you started off this article quoting another author. And the first question that was posed was, is white the new black? And then you sort of talked about the Tea Party movement and said that the Tea Party movement has taken on a separate identity, an identity of its own. Could you sort of tie these things together? Why pose this question, is white the new black, and then talk about the Tea Party movement? What is the connection there?
Well, is white the new black was a subheadline on a piece in the New Yorker magazine, which said that a lot of commentators were pointing out that the Tea Party movement was predominantly a white movement. And they were saying, in effect, that because it was predominantly white, therefore there was something inherently wrong with it. And what I was arguing in that piece, and I've argued subsequently, is there's no doubt about it that basically native-born Americans of European descent are the ones who are really angriest, I think, at the enormous numbers of illegal aliens marching into the country, many, if not most of them, from the third world, changing the character and composition of their country, and eventually voting them out of power.
But you also, go on to define ethno-nationalism, and you say that this is more powerful than communism, than fascism, than democracy. So what is it that you're getting at here?
Ethno-nationalism, which is the desire of peoples to break away from other peoples and establish their own nation with their own culture and language and religion. They all prevail, and they themselves rule virtually to the exclusion of others.
But what relevance does it have today, in the America that we're living in today?
That America is breaking down as a nation into enclaves. Ethnic enclaves, religious, political, and even racial enclaves. What it says is that America risks the same thing that happened to the Soviet Union in 1991, where it scattered and flew apart into 15 nations based primarily on what? Ethnicity. Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Georgians. And this, I think, is the great threat to all the multinational, multi-ethnic nations around the world. By 2050, there are going to be between 100 million and 135 million Hispanics in the United States, heavily concentrated in the American Southwest. Politically, it'll probably remain part of the United States. Ethnically, culturally, linguistically, I think it could very well be as much a part of Mexico as of the United States. Native-born Americans who are white and African-American are leaving California. And I think what you've got happening, I believe, is creations of these enclaves, which are basically, we're going to cease to be a nation and become more, I think, of an internal empire, like the old Roman Empire or the Habsburg Empire, which ruled over Croatians and Serbs and Czechs and Poles, as well as Germans and Hungarians.
I mean, a lot of experts would disagree and say a lot of the immigrants that are coming over here are trying to assimilate into the culture. They're trying to look for work. They're doing a good thing by being here.
They're assimilating into the economy, undeniably. But that's one thing between doing that and assimilating into the culture. The fastest growing radio and TV stations and newspapers in America are Hispanic. Now, folks come here and they don't learn the English language, and they don't immerse themselves in American culture, but bring their own culture and maintain it. How can you say we're fellow citizens if we can't even talk to each other?
Well, what if they're trying to have it both ways? What if they're trying to assimilate, but also hold on to their roots, also hold on to their culture, and that could be a reflection of, like you said, all these Hispanic newspapers and TV stations growing?
Well, that's what they're doing, and what I'm saying is, look, if we can't understand one another, half the people in Los Angeles County, which is 10 million people, half of them don't even speak English in their own home. How can you say we're one nation and one people the way we used to be, say, in 1960, if we're all speaking a different language? We're becoming a Tower of Babel, as in the Old Testament.
Well, let's talk about another controversy, Texas.
Sure. You think this was controversial?
What, the immigration law? I mean, a lot of people would say, yeah, it was pretty controversial. Even the federal government is calling the law controversial, so I think that...
The federal government ought to enforce the laws of the United States, and they wouldn't have this problem. This is the problem in Arizona. It is Barack Obama and the government of the United States is refusing to enforce the immigration laws of the United States, and thus Texas and Arizona are taking basically the law into their own hands, writing laws that replicate federal law and enforcing them. That's all that's going on.
But at the same time, how would you respond to the fact that violence at the border has actually been decreasing? They can't even use that as an argument to justify the law.
But the point is that you've got 500,000 illegal aliens in Arizona, which is roughly the size of the Army of the United States of America. They are a social problem, they're a cultural problem, and they're a criminal justice problem. And these folks would like to have them, since they don't belong here, like to have them leave Arizona. Is that not understandable, that this is our country and they have broken the law and broken into it, and they're holding down jobs when 15 million Americans are unemployed?
I know you're going to be just as passionate about this Texas controversy, changing the social studies and history curriculum there, sort of painting Senator Joe McCarthy in a more positive light, instead of calling it capitalism, calling it free enterprise. You sort of say, okay, so what's wrong with that?
Well, look, capitalism was a term basically used by Marx and Engels to describe what was going on in the West. I think free enterprise is a far more accurate depiction of what goes on in the United States of America.
Do you still believe that, with everything that goes on today, with all the bailouts and the protectionism?
I think you've got some super rich financial people whom you could call capitalists. But I'm a small businessman myself. I consider myself engaged in free enterprise.
I posed this question to a liberal radio host that I had on one day,
Schultz?
Tom Hartman.
Oh, I know Tom Hartman, yeah. I've done his show.
Yeah, and I said, okay, why can't you have it both ways? Why can't you take the Civil War and study it from both sides of the equation?
Exactly.
And his answer to that was sort of, well, you know, social studies class is only half an hour long, so we really don't have time for that. So who is it that determines what's important and what's not important when it comes to the history of America?
Well, that's a very good question. I think what you have when it comes to the history of America, first, you have to make sure that the facts are all accurate and are true, that you've represented both sides to every great quarrel. But as long as, A, the facts are true, and both sides to a quarrel are presented, including in the run-up to the Civil War. These disagreements that led to Civil War, I think you ought to explain both sides. This was not a side, and rarely is it in history, where one side is all evil and the other is all good.
Dr. Rand Paul. Speaking of controversial, right? I just got back from Kentucky not too long ago, was covering the Republican primaries there. You said that when he won the nomination for U.S. Senate for the Republican Party, that he was attacked by both the left and the right. Why is that?
Well, I think he's attacked by elements of the right, the neoconservatives who are very much in favor of going to war with Iran, for example, and military interventionism. And so they've attacked Rand Paul because he questions a foreign policy of interventionism. And he's much closer to my point of view, which is, look, we ought not to engage ourselves in wars and quarrels unless they are America's business. And he's attacked by the left, quite frankly, because Rand Paul, being a libertarian, would, if he's true to his philosophy, pretty much dismantle the federal welfare warfare state and get us back to what the libertarians call a night watchman state. You got one watchman on the wall, and that's all you need.
Well, then after he won, just a few days later, that's when the whole Civil Rights Act of '64, that whole controversy, came about. What do you think of his, of his remarks? Is it a case where he was trying to sort of broaden the discussion? He just used a very poor example to do that?
Tell you. Look, I go back to I was in the 1964 Civil Rights battle, writing as an editorial writer.
On which side?
I was writing on the correct side.
Which would be?
But no, in that battle, there was, for example, Senator Goldwater. Nobody would say Barry Goldwater was a racist. He desegregated his own department store in Arizona. He desegregated the Air National Guard when he was a commander. He contributed to the NAACP to desegregate the schools, but he voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because he said, when it comes to public accommodations inside a state, that is a responsibility of the state alone, and the federal government cannot supersede that power. It's a violation of the 10th Amendment and states' rights. And he held to that argument, and of course he lost the argument and he lost the election. But I think it was an intellectual argument, and to condemn people as racist simply because they say, look, whether it's good or whether it's not good, is it constitutional? And I don't think it is. I think is unjust, and it's really an argument against openness and the kind of debate America ought to have.
But considering the media firestorm that occurred after those remarks, is it a representation of the fact that perhaps America's not ready to have this debate?
I think that's right. Certainly the establishment is not ready to hear the arguments. No one else is, because of this orthodoxy of political correctness, whereby everybody has to stand up and salute the conventional wisdom and the conventional orthodoxy. And some of us don't.
Now, back in 2004, you wrote, quote, "The America of our grandchildren will be another country altogether, a nation unrecognizable to our parents, a giant Brazil of the North." Do you still feel that way?
Sure, it's becoming that. I think Brazil is a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic nation.
Is that a bad thing?
Well, I prefer I grew up in a different country, and I'm saying the country is going to be changed. Now, is it going to be changed for the better? Some people think it is going to be changed for the better. But I think what we're headed for is basically almost, as you see it developing in society, a war of all against all. Not only ethnically, but politically and culturally and socially. Look at the hostility and the toxicity of American politics today. As horrible as it's gotten, it's getting worse and worse and worse. What are we all arguing about, too? We're now arguing about the border, where our illegal aliens leaving the country, and the rest of it. So, I mean, I don't see that the future is going to be so much better than the past.
Thank you so much, Pat.
Okay.
In 2011, Buchanan wrote a book, Suicide of a Superpower. In one chapter titled The End of White America, Buchanan argues that an America without a white majority in the future could be headed down the road to collapse. He lost his job at MSNBC over it. I asked him if he still stood by the book.
Look, I believe that this country, that the more diverse culturally, racially, socially, ethnically a community is, the less capital there is, social capital of people working together. And I do think a country which loses its moral, cultural, and religious base, if you will, or had it thrown out as America has, and then comes in and embraces various groups and ethnic groups and races and things, tries to make them one country, I don't think it's going to work.
Would you make the same argument if, say, there wasn't going to be a white majority, but there was going to be a black majority or a Hispanic majority in America?
I think you could get an overwhelming Hispanic majority in the American Southwest, which will have one foot in Mexico and one foot in the United States. I think that's a real possibility. And
would that be detrimental to the health of the United States, though?
I think the United States could. I mean, I don't think we're one country. One nation. You know, the one thing people said to me more than any others on those rope lines you talk to is, Pat, we're losing the country we grew up in. And I think that's right.
Have you ever heard any people of color say that to you on the rope lines, or was it mostly?
I think there's probably a lot of people of color who are, I think you'll find an awful lot of them. Yes, the truth is, yes, you talk to some of them who, I won't say who they are, but it's the crime, the violence, the drugs, the broken families, all the rest of it.
In a new column titled The Great White Hope, Pat Buchanan writes, middle-aged whites are 4 times as likely as middle-aged blacks to try and kill themselves. Their fitness levels are falling as they suffer rising levels of physical pain, emotional stress, and mental depression, which helps explain the alcohol and drug addiction. Joining me now is Pat Buchanan. Pat, what is the social disaster that you see right now for white middle America?
Well, it's partly what you described there. I read that New York Times story and was astonished by it. But this is the only group of Americans, middle-class white folks, and I gather working-class whites as well, for whom the mortality rate, the death rate, is rising in middle age. And in my view, that there's a number of reasons for it. One is the economy. You've seen the real wages have been flat, of course. Tremendous numbers of people, even though unemployment is low, have dropped out of the labor force. I think culturally they're under assault. You know, the phrase angry white male is one of the few slurs that can be used today. And I think, you know, let me use something that happened. Merle Haggard died recently, Michael, and he had a line in his Okie from Muskogee. It said, "Are the good times really over for good?" And I think for many white Americans in the working class, they feel that they are over for good, and they look to Donald Trump frankly, the way a lot of African Americans look to Barack Obama, with hope.
When you say that they're under cultural assault, as I read your piece, I thought the WASPs probably said the same thing when families like Smirkanich and Grovich, my forefathers, were coming to this country at the turn of the last century.
Well, no, Smirkanich and some of my ancestors and the folks that came from Eastern and Southern Europe, they were under ethnic and cultural assault, I believe, in this country, and they rose up and they came into their own, and they came into the middle class. I don't think the WASPs, really, to their credit, WASPs built America in the 18th century, but I don't recall them ever being under cultural assault.
In the last line of your piece, and I'll put it up on the screen, you refer to Donald Trump as the Great White Hope, and indeed you said so just a moment ago. Are you helping or hurting him when you cast his campaign in those terms?
Well, I think that I just took that term from Jess Willard in 1915. It was a play in 1970 as well, The Great White Hope. And it's just a term, but what is very important is what it indicates. The largest turnout ever has taken place in the Republican primaries. And enormously, the votes for Donald Trump have been white votes, working class votes, middle class votes, people driven by nationalism and populism who've never come out before. And I think, Michael, we got to explain that and understand it. And I think the best effort I can do to do that, and I think, have the political correctness lines thrown at you on every line you use in the column, I don't think is helpful.
But isn't Donald Trump stirring that base by pointing in the direction of the others and laying off the blame on them for what's going on among this core constituency?
I don't agree. I don't agree with that. He says, look, predominantly the folks coming across the southern border are Mexican folks who are coming across illegally. He's referring to them. He's going to build the wall. I understand that, and people take that maybe as anti-Mexican, whereas some of us take it as trying to preserve the character and the laws of the United States of America, which are under assault.
When you talk about the economic problems of those that you write about, you say it's largely attributable to illegal immigration, and you also say the effect of globalization. I think it's probably technology and globalization, not so much people who are coming illegally to do jobs that, frankly, many Americans don't want to do and aren't willing to do.
Well, Michael, if you read I believe I said in the column that I not only referred to legals, but illegals. Excuse me, I include illegals there. And the point is, if you add, say, 40 or 50 million folks in the United States, as we have since 1965, and a million or more legal and illegal every year, that is a huge increase in the labor supply. And the demand remains constant, and therefore the wages go down. Real wages have been stagnant for American workers and American families of the working and middle class almost since 1974. In addition to that, 55,000 factories were exported in the first decade of the 21st century, and something like 6 million manufacturing jobs lost. Michael, you got to look at these figures and understand they have a dramatic impact upon Americans working in middle class, and those folks that Nobel laureate that made that report has gotten to the reason why or indicated it.
A final question, political ramification of all of this. Are demographics not destiny? I've got Neil Newhouse in the on-deck circle. I'm going to ask him, are there enough of the Buchanan, Trump constituents left to get somebody elected president?
I will say this, the Republican Party is under a demographic death sentence in these terms. Even if you get, say, 60 to 65% of the white vote, which Nixon got and Reagan got, both of them winning 49 state landslides, when the white vote diminishes, it's now about 72% of the electorate, 63% of the population. As it goes down further and further, you're going to have to get Hispanic votes, you're going to have to get some more African American votes, and you got to get more Asian American votes, or quite frankly, the Republican Party is going to go the way of the Whigs. I wrote that in my book, Suicide of a Superpower.
Pat Buchanan, have a good Memorial Day. Thank you so much for being